Good evening and welcome. Tonight we are going to read some history magazine articles about famous murders in history. And as you can see here, we'll be talking about the infamous death of Rasputin, the mad monk of Russia, along with some other figures in history which you probably have not heard of, including Hypatia of Alexandria, and we'll be talking about Germanicus of Rome and the stories of how they were murdered, one mysteriously, one not so mysteriously. And then finally, we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects in history, which is bog bodies. And I'm covering up this picture because this article does show actual pictures of bog bodies, and if you've never seen one, they barely decompose. So if that bothers you, I'm saving it for last so that you can enjoy the rest of the video. We'll talk about them in another video. We'll save this for last so you can enjoy the video and click off if you need to, or just turn your screen off, whatever you need to do so that you're not looking at actual dead bodies. But I did not choose these articles. These were chosen by my channel members, and quite a lot of them wanted to hear about murders. They were Krista, Alessia, All the Happy Squirrels, Marta, Dreadlock Kickboxer, Miss Knit Whispers, and Danny. They all picked these articles. And if you would like to someday pick history magazine articles, I will be getting a new issue in August. You can join my memberships by clicking the join button right down there. Or if you're on mobile and it's not there, you can go to the description box of this video and click the very first link in there. And you can join for only 99 US cents. It's the lowest possible price I could set it as. YouTube is constantly like, oh, you need to make this higher, you need to add more tiers with more money. And I'm like, no, I want to make it as affordable as possible and give all of you guys exclusive content, your name in every video, and lots of other fun little perks, including picking history magazines. You're getting a lot of behind the scenes stuff right now because I'm actually moving. Actually, the day this video goes up is the day that I'm moving to Washington. So if you want to see all the behind the scenes of that in my life, you can join the memberships. So it's going to be a long video. So let's get right into it, starting with the story of Rasputin and his very bizarre murder. On the night of December 16th to 17th, 1916, a murder took place at one of Russia's grandest palaces. The crime marked the culmination of an ugly, concerted campaign against both the victim and his imperial Russian patrons. It would rock the Tsarist elite at a time when World War I was ravaging Europe and Russia was inexorably sliding toward revolution. More than 100 years later, the sensationalist reporting of the murder of Grigory Rasputin, for so long erroneously portrayed as a mad monk, has persisted in distorting the truth about his close relationship with Russia's last Tsar and Tsarina, Nicholas and Alexandra. How this lowly peasant and former horse dealer achieved such unique access to the reclusive Romanovs alarmed the imperial inner circle, who demonized Rasputin and those who followed him. From country to court. Born in 1869 to peasant farmers, Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin grew up in Pokrovskoye, an obscure village in western Siberia, some 1,600 miles from St. Petersburg. Little is known for sure about his upbringing, as records are scarce. At age 19, he married Praskovia Fyodorovna Dubrovina, who later bore him 4 children, When he left home in 1892, his family stayed behind. Rasputin is said to have experienced a religious epiphany and spent 3 months at a monastery, though he never became an ordained priest. Instead, he wandered Russia for several years, seeking personal spiritual enlightenment, very much in the tradition of the itinerant Russian holy man. By 1905, Rasputin had established himself in St. Petersburg as a spiritual guru and healer at a time when interest in alternative medicine and the occult were fashionable among Russia's elite. There he gathered around himself a clique of adoring, mainly female acolytes, who revered him as a man of God. But soon rumors began to circulate about Rasputin's libidinous behavior as a heavy drinker and sexual predator. He led a strange and contradictory double life. In the presence of his admirers, he cultivated a persona that was sober, wise, and advocated purity of body and mind. While away from them, Rasputin would sometimes run riot as a drunken sexual degenerate. Projecting a perpetual pious image was hard work. Rasputin was a deeply conflicted man, torn between his profound religious beliefs and a deep rebellious compulsion to sin. The Russian public was already deeply suspicious of Rasputin when he was introduced to the Tsar and Tsarina in 1905. His reputation as a healer drew him in closer to the royal family because of the poor health of their son and heir, Tsarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. In 1908, Rasputin allegedly used his abilities to ease Alexei's suffering during a severe episode. Alexandra saw Rasputin as a healer and relied on him to help in Alexei's care. Rasputin, however, could not limit his role to health and spirituality. He also began offering political advice to both Nicholas and Alexandra. In doing so, he began making enemies for himself in the Russian aristocracy and government. Other members of the Romanov family despised Rasputin as a quack and con man. Alexandra became estranged from her own sister, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, after she warned the Tsarina about Rasputin. The situation grew so dire that even Alexandra could not protect her beloved father Grigory from the hatred of her own family and friends. In 1915, World War I was raging, and Nicholas left Russia to spend time on the Eastern Front. Lonely and distraught, Alexandra began spending more and more time in Rasputin's company. Rasputin now had his own personal chauffeur to take him out to Tsarskoye Selo for private prayer meetings with the Tsarina. Gossip about their relationship took an ugly turn. Concern grew within the Romanovs that Alexandra was leading the family into disrepute. Lurid rumors flew that her relationship with Rasputin had become sexual, as pornographic images of them were circulated in St. Petersburg. Rasputin and Alexandra were talked of as dark forces who would bring Russia to ruin. Danger to Russia. Rasputin had long been the target of death threats, and soon there were open and widespread calls for his removal by whatever means necessary. After a knife attack by a woman in June 1914 left him with a near-fatal stomach wound, he was accompanied everywhere by a police agent. No one could get close enough to kill him because Rasputin was always carefully guarded. Rasputin's alleged influence over the Tsarina generated serious concerns among several senior members of the Romanov family. They tacitly encouraged a murder plot hatched by a young, impetuous, and inexperienced 29-year-old Prince Felix Yusupov. Born into one of Russia's wealthiest families and married to Nicholas II's niece, Irina, Yusupov considered it his patriotic duty to rid Russia of Rasputin. With Rasputin out of the picture, Yusupov hoped to restore the reputation of the Tsar, as well as help Nicholas rely more on his extended family, the nobility, and the Duma. In October 1916, Yusupov I don't know what that word is, veiled his friend and Tsar Nicholas's cousin, 25-year-old Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, into planning the murder with him. At the end of November, they had recruited Vladimir Purishkevich, a member of the Russian State Duma who had already openly lambasted Rasputin. 2 others were taken on to assist in the final plan: a lifeguards officer, Lieutenant Sergei Sukhotin, and a Polish doctor, Stanislav Lazavert, who was to help with administering the poison, potassium cyanide crystals, which Yusupov had obtained. The murder of the monk. The best known account of the events of December 16th to 17th, 1916 comes from Yusupov's own writings, published some 10 years after Rasputin's death. In La Fin de Rasputin, later in his memoirs Lost Splendor that followed in the 1950s, Yusupov lays out the assassination plans from start to finish. To begin, Yusupov had already made Rasputin's acquaintance in the preceding weeks by consulting him a few times about health problems. The Yusupov family owned a palace on St. Petersburg Moika Canal, which was chosen as the location for the murder. Yusupov would invite Rasputin to the Moika to meet his wife, the beautiful Princess Irina. To conceal the visit and elude his security detail, Rasputin would arrive very late on December 16th. Yusupov had prepared a small basement room to receive Rasputin. Dimly lit with colored lanterns and a blazing open fire, the room was richly arranged with works of art and curios, carved oak chairs, cabinets of ebony, a Persian carpet, and a white bearskin rug. The table was set with a samovar for tea, biscuits, and fancy cakes, the kind that Yusupov said Rasputin liked. Before Rasputin's arrival, Sukhotin had ground the poison into a powder that Lazavert was said to have sprinkled inside the cakes. Yusupov had also given Pavlovich and Purishkevich a potassium cyanide solution to lace Rasputin's wine. Just after midnight, Lazavert, disguised as a chauffeur, drove Yusupov to Rasputin's home at 64 Gorokhovaya Street. Rasputin's daughters recalled that he appeared in good spirits that night, but also seemed highly nervous, as though he sensed something was amiss. Rasputin had dressed up for the occasion. He wore a silk shirt embroidered with cornflowers, specially made for him by the Tsarina, velvet breeches, and polished boots. He had washed and combed his hair, and, as Yusupov recalled, smelled of cheap soap. Meanwhile, Pavlovich and Purishkevich, who remained at the Moika Palace, made it appear as if a party were going on upstairs. As Rasputin, Lazavert, and Yusupov entered the palace through a side entrance, they heard music playing on the phonograph upstairs. 2 young women had also arrived. At some point, Rasputin believed the lovely Irina would come down to meet him in the basement. Irina had actually refused to be involved in the night's events and remained far away on the family estate in Crimea. Yusupov offered Rasputin the cakes. At first he refused, then reluctantly took one. Then a second. Nothing happened. Yusupov could not understand why the poison had not worked. He then persuaded his guest to sample Madeira wine from his own Crimean vineyards, having managed surreptitiously to slip some poison into the glass. Rasputin drank the wine like a connoisseur, then took some more, but still mystifyingly, the poison had no effect. Oh, this is a picture of the room. You can go see it now with these mannequins set up as it was that night, at least. Things continued in this way for some time. Rasputin prevailed on Yusupov to entertain him with a guitar. He drank more tea, his head drooped, and his eyes closed. He was tired, but yet, more than 2 hours later, the poison had not done its work. All this time, Yusupov's co-conspirators were waiting upstairs. Eventually, an increasingly frantic Yusupov went to consult with them. Purishkevich recalled Yusupov frantically telling them that The only effect that I can see of the poison is that he is constantly belching and that he dribbles a bit. The trio resolved they had no option but to shoot Rasputin. Yusupov removed a Browning pistol from his writing desk and returned to the basement, where he found Rasputin breathing heavily and complaining of a heavy head and a burning sensation in his stomach. As Rasputin stood up, Yusupov raised his pistol and fired at him, hitting him in the side of the chest. Pavlovich and Purishkevich rushed down to see Rasputin lying on the bearskin rug. Lazoverd declared that Rasputin was dead, and the conspirators disappeared upstairs. Yusupov was uneasy and went back down to double-check the body. As he drew close, Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened wide, the green eyes of a viper staring at me with an expression of diabolical hatred, he recalled. Suddenly, with a superhuman effort, Rasputin lunged to his feet and rushed at Yusupov with an animalistic roar, trying to grab his throat. Despite the poison and the bullet in his chest, Rasputin seemed to find enormous strength, but then crashed onto his back. Yusupov's account at this point strains credibility, ascribing demonic powers to the injured man. Utterly terrified, Yusupov rushed upstairs for help, retching with fear. Purishkevich now assumed control. Cocking his savage pistol, he went down to find that Rasputin had managed to get out through the side door into the snow-covered courtyard, staggering, left in his agony. Purishkevich fired once and missed, then a second time at a run, and again managed to miss. Despite his wound, Rasputin, crawling on his knees, reached the gate of the courtyard when Purishkevich fired a third time and hit him in the back. He then fired a fourth and fatal shot directly into Rasputin's forehead. Pavlovich, Sukhotin, and Lazoverd then disposed of Rasputin's body. They wrapped it in a heavy cloth and tied it with rope. They dragged it into Pavlovich's car and drove to the large Petrovsky Bridge by the Neva, where they threw the body through the broken ice. They drove home just as dawn was breaking. Rumors of Rasputin's disappearance and probable murder began to circulate rapidly in St. Petersburg. At the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsarina waited anxiously for news while the police initiated a search. On December 19th, Rasputin's body, his arms frozen over his head in an eerie gesture, was found by the river police near Krestovsky Island. You can see it right here. Oh my gosh. Oh, that's eerie. When the news got out, the public rejoiced on the streets, said prayers of thanks in church, and lit candles in front of the icons. Yusupov and Pavlovich were feted as national heroes. Rasputin's remains were taken in a Red Cross van to a home for army veterans. On Nicholas II's specific instructions, an autopsy was conducted on the still frozen body that evening. A doctor named Dmitry Kosorotov ascertained that Rasputin had been shot 3 times by different caliber revolvers, once in the left side of the chest, another in the back, and the fatal shot, fired point-blank range, possibly from a .455 Wembley revolver in the head. Sorry, I don't know anything about guns. I don't know how to say that. There were no traces of poison found in the body, only alcohol. For more than 100 years, Yusupov's account has been the accepted source on Rasputin's murder, though many have expressed reservations about its accuracy. One of the biggest points of contention is whether the cakes had indeed been poisoned. Not long before his death, Lazoverd said he had second thoughts about poisoning Rasputin and had substituted something harmless for the cyanide. Yusupov's dramatic telling of the night's events, accurate or not, has become stuck in the public imagination. Aftermath. It is said that Tsarina Alexandra retrieved the embroidered shirt that Rasputin had been wearing and treasured it as a religious talisman. After the autopsy, Rasputin's body was prepared for burial and laid out with an icon from the imperial family on his breast. At midnight on December 21st, Rasputin's zinc coffin was taken to Alexander Park at Tsarskoye Selo, where it was secretly buried in the presence of Nicholas, Alexandra, and a few others, on the site of a new chapel that was being built there. Authorities quickly caught the conspirators and placed them under house arrest. As punishment, the Tsar exiled Yusupov to a family estate in Belgorod Oblast. Grand Duke Dmitry was banished from court and sent to fight on the Persian front. Dmitry's punishment drew heated opposition from the Romanov family, but the decision probably saved his life. When the Tsarist aristocracy collapsed after the February 1917 revolution, Dmitry was a long way from danger. The conspirators claimed to have killed Rasputin to save the Russian throne, but it seems their actions did little to help the monarchy in the long term. Tensions caused by World War I and domestic turmoil boiled over a few months after Rasputin's death. After the revolution of 1917, Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were imprisoned by Russia's provincial government and exiled, first to Siberia and then to Yekaterinburg. The entire family would be murdered there in July 1918. In early March 1917, Rasputin's resting place was discovered at Tsarskoye Selo. The provincial government feared his grave could serve as a potential pilgrimage site and ordered it destroyed. The coffin was dug up in secret, and Rasputin's remains were burned. For the Russian public, fueled by their irrational and deep-seated hatred of him, it was a fitting end. Now, usually in these articles, we look through all the pictures and stuff. Like this next page talks about Rasputin in the media, like the song and movies and stuff. But we have a lot of other articles to get to, so we're actually going to skip all the little pictures here. Although these are quite interesting because a lot of them are actual photographs, right, from that time. But let's move on. All right, let me set this aside. So we can talk about Hypatia of Alexandria. Not a very well-known figure. You may have heard of her and not even realized it. So let's read about her life and her very brutal death. Hypatia reigned as not only the greatest philosopher of her native Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, but also as one of late antiquity's greatest thinkers. These feats alone would merit sufficient preservation of her name through the ages, yet this is not history's account. Instead, Hypatia is remembered mostly for her horrific murder in the year 415 CE at the hands of a fanatical Christian mob. Contemporaneous sources recount the murder in detail. The Christian authors Socrates Scholasticus and John of Nikiu, as well as pagan authors including the Greek Neoplatonist philosopher Damascus, agree in their descriptions of her death. She was forcibly dragged from her chariot in Alexandria and brought to a church called Caesareum. There she was stripped naked, flayed, and brutally murdered. After dismembering her body, the mob burned her remains. Other accounts state she was giving a lecture when the mob found her, and after taking her to the church, she was dragged through the streets. Cyril, Patriarch or Archbishop of Alexandria, plotted her murder and ordered it carried out. Whichever version is more accurate, it has long been believed she was assassinated by a rabble of Christian fanatics for her philosophical beliefs. That is, she didn't support Christianity in a world in which Christians and pagans were at odds. But there's more to the story. Ancient Alexandria. At the time of Hypatia's birth, around 360 CE, the important cultural and intellectual center of her native Alexandria was waning. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, this great city was the site of the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the ancient world's 7 wonders, and the Museion, which included the famous Library of Alexandria, said to have served as a training ground for the ancient world's best writers, doctors, scientists, and philosophers. After Julius Caesar conquered Alexandria in 48 BCE and burned part of the city's great library, Alexandria began a slow decline. In 364 CE, the Roman Empire split in two, and Alexandria remained in the eastern portion, controlled by Constantinople, which today is Istanbul. Around this time, disputes emerged between the city's Christian denominations. One ancient writer noted that there were no people who loved to fight more than those of Alexandria. Then, in 380 CE, Emperor Theodosius I declared Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, including Alexandria, mandating punishment to non-believers. Tensions rose between Christians and non-Christians. Early years. Against this backdrop of religious and political strife, Hypatia received an excellent education under the guidance of her father, the renowned mathematician and astronomer Theon Greyjoy, who taught at the Museon. He introduced her to a wide range of subjects, including mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and literature. Early on, Hypatia demonstrated exceptional intellectual abilities and a passion for learning. She delivered detailed commentaries on the great works of mathematics and astronomy that had been produced in Alexandria centuries earlier in the times of the Ptolemies. However, it wasn't Hypatia's talent for mathematics and astronomy, or even her inventions, that had the greatest impact. She would earn renown primarily as a philosopher. Hypatia espoused a school of thought known as Neoplatonism. Reinterpreting the ideas of ancient Greek philosopher Plato, this teaching emerged in the 3rd century CE. Combining spirituality and science, it applied mathematics and astronomy to philosophy as a way to understand the universe and the individual's place in it. These scientific disciplines were all roots to knowledge of the One, the supreme being from which all things emanate. While Hypatia's philosophy was seen as pagan, Christians identified the One with their God, and as such, both pagans and Christians could abide this philosophical framework. Hypatia taught at the Neoplatonist school of philosophy and drew large crowds of pagans and Christians to her lectures. She doesn't appear to have been a devout pagan and didn't practice theurgy, the use of magic and oracles that many Neoplatonists saw as another path to the One. While all around her, Christians and pagans were involved in clashes that were tearing the city of Alexandria apart, she seemingly maintained a neutral position. Hypatia certainly remained distant from the events that in 391 culminated in the ancient Serapeum Temple of Alexandria being destroyed by Christians. Other pagan intellectuals, meanwhile, were active in defending the great temple dedicated to the god Serapis, and even boasted of murdering Christians. So the traditional view that Hypatia's violent death was the result of ideological conflict between pagans and Christians doesn't tell the whole story. Instead, there's another angle that makes more sense. The suspects. One clear thing stands out in regard to Hypatia's murder. The act was highly ritualized, a feature it has in common with the violent deaths of 2 Alexandrian patriarchs, the extreme Arian George of Cappadocia, who was killed in 361, and Proterius, who was killed in 457. Although the circumstances surrounding each of the deaths of these bishops differ from Hypatia's, all 3 murders do fit similar patterns. The patriarchs' corpses were, like Hypatia's, paraded by their murderers along the Canopic Way, Alexandria's main thoroughfare. The victims' bodies were dismembered and portions of their remains transferred to each of the city's districts for subsequent cremation. It's interesting to note that in 391, after the assault of the ancient Serapeum Temple, the statue of the Greco-Egyptian deity Serapis itself was subjected to the same ritualized violence. Seen in this context, Hypatia's death could be interpreted as a premeditated assassination rather than a spontaneous act by a bloodthirsty mob. it's possible she was used as a pawn in the political maneuvering of the moment, and there is one very clear political standoff that fits. Hypatia became involved in the showdown between two men who were both Christians, Cyril, Patriarch of Alexandria, and Orestes, Alexandria's Roman governor. Their motives. At the time, Cyril engaged in ruthless power politics to stamp out pagan influence in Alexandria. He wasn't afraid to use violence to achieve his goals. He also was involved in the expulsion of the Jews from Alexandria following their attacks on Christians. Either the Roman prefect Orestes, who in the imperial administration's efforts to preserve Alexandria's stability had to count on support from the municipal aristocracy, who mostly worshipped pagan gods. Orestes also needed to avoid sparking opposition from the Jews while garnering support from the Christians, who opposed Cyril and his violent methods. Orestes, unlike Cyril, needed to appeal to a diverse group of people. Orestes turned to his friend Hypatia. She was a suitable intermediary because of her status as a philosopher and because she had stayed at arm's length from activity defending polytheism. She was well regarded by those across the Alexandrian elite, who were neither agitators for one side or the other, nor favored violence. Another aspect that made Hypatia stand out was that over many years she had cultivated a network. Her contacts included former students within powerful Christian circles, both in Constantinople, the seat of the Roman Empire, and in Alexandria. Cyril thus viewed Hypatia as a possible threat to his hold over the city's Christians. The plot. To neutralize Hypatia, it seems that Cyril mounted a smear campaign accusing Hypatia of black magic and describing her as a dangerous witch using spells to lure people to her lectures. It was claimed she had ensnared Orestes into skipping Mass and allowing non-Christians into his house. Socrates Scholasticus notes that, as she, Hypatia, had frequent interviews with Orestes, it was calumniously reported among the Christian populace that it was by her influence he was prevented from being reconciled to Cyril. All of these cliches, which have been used throughout the ages to discredit women who occupy positions other than the traditional ones of wife and mother, were intended to frame Hypatia as a dangerous public enemy. Cyril couldn't commit the murder himself, nor did he have to. He instead relied on his Parabolani. Originally, this group of lay Christians acted as a charitable organization, caring for the city's neediest people. But by the time Cyril was in charge, the Parabolani had become more like an armed militia in the patriarch's service. Although there is no proof that Cyril ordered Hypatia's murder, everything suggests that Cyril had much to gain from her death, and that the Parabolani did the deed on his behalf. Her assassination ended the threat she posed to Cyril through her support for Orestes' policy of tolerance. Her death served as the breaking point between religious authority embodied by Patriarch Cyril and civil authority embodied by Prefect Orestes. It was Cyril who won the day. Hypatia's death, however, was not a defeat for the pagans. Christians and pagans continued to coexist in Alexandria for more than a century. Neoplatonism thrived until the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century and counted both Christians and pagans among its adherents. In the 6th century, the director of the school was a pagan, Ammonius Hermiae, while his deputy and the editor of his works was a Christian, John Philoponus. After Hypatia's killing, no more was heard of Orestes. Although the Christian leaders didn't eradicate pagan philosophy from the city, they did crack down on secular authorities. Shining light. Hypatia's story lived on. Her character and intellect were noted even by hostile Christian writers. In the 18th century, Voltaire wrote about her to condemn an overzealous church. The English clergyman Charles Kingsley penned a Victorian romance about her. She is the heroine of the 2009 Spanish movie Agora, whose fictitious plot has her saving the Alexandria Library from Christian fanatics. Her endurance in a patriarchal society makes her a feminist hero up to the present day, and she merits more recognition to history beyond the sensation of her horrific murder. See, there's some more depictions of her in popular media, just like Rasputin said. But when I said you might know her, this is a very, very famous painting by Raphael called The School of Athens, in which he put pretty much every famous philosopher and freethinker together in one room, even if they lived in very different time periods. And it's believed that, let's see, that she's like over here, right? Oh, right here. She's right here in the painting. That's a close-up. That's believed to be Hypatia, but apparently it's not 100%, because it says over here Raphael never admitted that he put her in there and that it could have been his mistress. But that's the popular theory. So you may have seen her before in this very famous painting. But let's move on to, I like how we're going in reverse history. Usually I go the other way. We're going backwards and backwards. Next we're going to talk about Germanicus, the death of Rome's golden boy. And if you haven't heard of him, that's because he was murdered before he could become emperor. Let's read about his life. Germanicus was not supposed to die young. The great-nephew of Emperor Augustus was supposed to become the next ruler of Rome. But at the peak of his political career, Rome's golden boy suddenly and mysteriously died. Germanicus was handsome, gifted with social graces, and a charismatic leader on the battlefield. Emperor Augustus arranged for his heir, Tiberius, to formally adopt Germanicus at age 19, giving a tacit indication that Germanicus, not Tiberius' son Drusus, should be the next emperor. In the year 14 CE, Augustus died, and Tiberius became Rome's next emperor. Sorry for my tummy. Some believed, perhaps in bad faith, that Germanicus' talents were overshadowing Tiberius, a diligent man who lacked his adopted son's charisma. With rumors of Tiberius' envy and a plethora of political enemies around him, Germanicus had a number of potential rivals who might have wished him dead. When he died at age 34, many believed that the cause was murder. War hero. It was assumed that Germanicus would one day rule the empire and should be trained for the role. When Tiberius became emperor, he commissioned Germanicus to re-establish Roman influence east of the Rhine River after the Germanic tribes defeated the Roman legions in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in the year 9 CE. The young Germanicus, who was at this time consul in Gaul, crossed the Rhine and invaded Germania with the support of 8 loyal legions. He finally achieved victory at the Battle of Edistaviso, near the Weser River in the year 16. Tiberius granted Germanicus a triumph and asked him to return to Rome. 1st and 2nd century CE historian Tacitus described how Tiberius praised his adopted son. The commotion in the east could only be settled by the wisdom of Germanicus, for his own years were trending to their autumn, and those of Drusus were as yet scarcely mature. Despite malicious rumors about the emperor's envy of Germanicus's military successes, Tiberius gave him special mandate to sort out affairs in the Greek East in 17 CE. Knowing and governing these provinces was an indispensable step in the training of future emperors. But Tiberius made a decision not understood by some. In addition to granting Germanicus supreme command of the East, Tiberius appointed statesman Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso as governor of Syria. The province of Syria was influential because the legions protecting the dangerous frontier facing the Parthian Empire, Rome's main enemy at the time, were stationed in the Syrian capital of Antioch. Piso, a Roman senator of ancient lineage, had a reputation for being severe, and it seems that Germanicus was opposed to his appointment. Rumors abounded, Critics said that Emperor Tiberius had appointed Piso at the instigation of his own mother, Empress Livia, with the intention of secretly controlling Germanicus. Piso was accompanied in Syria by his wife Plancina, a close friend of Livia, and charged, according to ancient historians, with waging a campaign of hostility and intimidation against Germanicus and his wife Agrippina. In the Annals, Tacitus writes, the belief has been held that he did in fact receive private instructions from Tiberius, and Plancina, beyond question, had advice from the ex-empress, bent with feminine jealousy upon persecuting Agrippina. Foreboding future. Germanicus's journey to the east was in many ways a consolidation of power. First he arrived at Nicopolis, the city built by Augustus near Actium. Germanicus traveled to Athens from Actium. This was a happy and festive visit, where his whole family was received with great honors. But the road to the east had its tribulations too. When Germanicus arrived in the province of Asia, he visited the famous oracle at Claros near Colophon, where the priests transmitted the will of Apollo through verse. To everyone's surprise, the oracle did not have a favorable message for Germanicus. In fact, the priest foretold his premature death. Germanicus carried out his duties in the east effectively. He saw the new king of Armenia crowned and built diplomatic relations with Parthia and its satellite kingdoms. In Piso's eyes, Germanicus's friendly diplomacy was weakening Rome's position. Piso began a smear campaign against Germanicus, while corrupting the legions by buying their support to turn them against Germanicus. The relationship between the two men worsened when the latter decided to visit Egypt. Just real quick, this picture here of a warning hand, like a protection hand, we're going to see this in the next History Magazine video, because the next video is going to be all about Rome and stuff like this. So we're going to see this picture again. Just remember that. Lauded in Egypt. According to a papyrus found in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, when Germanicus arrived in Alexandria, the locals welcomed him with an outpouring of enthusiasm. They would shout out their support during his public appearances. Perhaps encouraged by this reception, Germanicus tried to alleviate a grain shortage in the province by opening the imperial granaries, the main source of wheat for the city of Rome. Wheat supplies to the empire's capital were impacted, generating a fear of food shortages. Germanicus's oversight was making Tiberius uneasy, and the feeling was compounded by Piso's negative reports. The relationship between Tiberius and Germanicus worsened, and the two grew estranged. When Germanicus returned from Egypt to Antioch in Syria, his enmity with Piso was already common knowledge. Then Germanicus suddenly fell ill. In antiquity, identifying the cause of any illness was tricky. It wasn't easy to accept that a 34-year-old man destined for the highest responsibilities could fall seriously ill with no warning or clear cause. Looking for other reasons, friends and relatives believed Piso, Germanicus's great enemy, had led a conspiracy against him. Germanicus himself agreed. Soon, those close to Germanicus claimed to have found evidence in the palace that the general was being subjected to malicious magical practices. They claimed to have found charred remains of human bodies, accompanied by incantations and curses. Curse tablets were thin sheets of lead inscribed with magic spells. We're going to read a whole article about curse tablets next time. I think next week. Yep, next week. Be sure to subscribe so you won't miss out about curse tablets. Found among the curse tablets was one bearing the name Germanicus, surrounded by magical invocations to the gods of the underworld. Germanicus's supporters set out to find the culprit. It was assumed Piso had commissioned them. Piso's wife, Plancina, employed a woman who was said to be notorious for her poisons and evil arts, which only added to their suspicions. Circumstantial evidence against Piso was stacking up. Aware of Germanicus's accusations, Piso decided to leave Syria for Rome. While en route, news reached him that Germanicus was making a recovery. When the same news reached Rome, it was received with widespread joy. A crowd armed with torches rushed to the streets in the middle of the night, carrying animals for sacrifice and shouting, "Salva Roma, salva patria, salvis est Germanicus." Rome is safe, the fatherland is safe, Germanicus is safe. Sorry for my tummy. Their mood was short-lived. Before he passed, Germanicus openly accused both Piso and Plancina of his murder. Tacitus's Annals describes Germanicus on his deathbed, saying, "Now in fact I am separated from you by the wickedness of Piso and Plancina, his wife, and I leave my prayers in your hearts." Doctors carefully inspected his body for evidence of poison, but found none. In Antioch, his funeral was a simple affair. But Tacitus relays that mourners offered recollection of his virtues. There were those who compared his decease with that of Alexander the Great. Piso on trial. Germanicus's body was cremated, and the ashes were given to his widow to be returned to Rome. Accompanied by her children, the grieving Agrippina used this journey to both honor her late husband and to call out those she believed were responsible for his death. When she arrived on Italy's southern coast at Brindisi, Agrippina was welcomed with great outpourings of public grief. Tiberius, however, was markedly absent, had only allowed modest ceremonies for Germanicus to be held in Rome. Unsettled by the populace's mourning, Tiberius turned attention to Piso, who had returned to Syria after Germanicus's death. Piso would be put on trial before the Senate. The Senate's verdict was conclusive. Piso, governor of Syria, was convicted of killing Germanicus, insubordination, and having provoked the civil war in Syria that broke out after Germanicus died. The governor was condemned to death, but he committed suicide before the punishment could be carried out. After Piso's death, the Senate imposed 6 posthumous penalties against him, including forbidding public mourning, removal of portraits and statues, and confiscation of his property. Despite Piso's conviction, debate over Germanicus's death persists today. Scholars do believe he may have died of natural causes, but no definitive proof exists. If Germanicus was murdered, Piso remains the lead suspect, but Tiberius has also come under suspicion. Late in the emperor's reign, he began to target his political opponents, including Agrippina and 2 of Germanicus's sons. But to complicate matters for future historians, Tiberius adopted Germanicus's surviving son, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, who would become the next emperor. History knows him better as Caligula. So that is that story. Isn't that wild? Here's Agrippina arriving the shore with the ashes of her husband, and everyone's like, "Oh man, not Germanicus, he was so cool." Poor guy. But that is his story. So we are moving on now to the bog bodies. So again, we are going to see actual pictures of bog bodies. So if that does bother you, you might want to turn off your screen and just listen to the audio, or just click off the video here. Totally fine with me if that bothers you. And we're going to start off with my favorite bog body, which is weird to say. It's Toland Man. So, like, some people went through, like, Egyptian pharaoh mummy phases. I went through a bog body phase as a child, which sounds so weird. But I was just fascinated by the fact that these people look like they could have died a week ago, right? And Toland Man's so interesting because he's dressed like he's, like, from the Moomin Valley. It's the only way I can describe it. And it's very obvious that he met quite a gruesome end. So let's read about a bit about his life and maybe some of the other people who met very murderous ends and were left in the bogs. Marshes, mires, and swamps are murky, mysterious places found across northern Europe. A space between two worlds, a bog occurs when dry land and a body of water intersect, creating a soft, spongy terrain that is neither wholly liquid nor solid. This liminal quality may have led the early peoples of northern Europe to associate bogs with the supernatural. They were portals to other worlds, where gods and restless spirits dwelled. In more recent times, peat bogs are seen as valuable natural resources, yet they've retained their mystical qualities thanks to the thousands of human bodies that have emerged from their depths. Europe's bog bodies have fascinated people since one was first documented in 1640 in Holstein, Germany. Since then, some 2,000 more bodies have emerged in the wetlands of Ireland, the United Kingdom, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, Scandinavia, and the Baltic states. A groundbreaking study published in January 2023 in the journal Antiquity estimates that figure is conservative, and the actual number could be much higher. Bog bodies provide a tangible connection with the remote ancestral past, while also serving as a grim reminder of the harsh daily lives of most people. Looking at the mortal remains, whether the peaceful visage of Toland man or the curly hair of Boxton man, one cannot help but imagine their lives and ponder the causes of their deaths. Were they the most loathed among their people, or were they sacrificed to please the gods? Whether accidental drownings, executed outlaws, fallen warriors, or human sacrifices, these people's well-preserved remains are providing fascinating windows into a 7,000-year-old tradition and the cultures who practiced it. Power of peat. Many bog bodies have disturbingly lifelike appearances thanks to a natural chemistry that prevents the decay of some human tissues. Bogs accumulate a muddy layer called peat, which is made of decaying plants and mosses. Peat has been used for centuries as fuel and fertilizer, but many peatlands are now valued for their role as highly efficient and compact carbon sinks and important parts of the fight against climate change. Sphagnum moss is a key component of peat and gives northern Europe's bogs their seemingly magical preservation properties. These northern wetlands are cold, low in oxygen, and very acidic. This environment, combined with antibiotic properties, the moss creates a perfect soup for preserving the human body's calcified and keratinous structures, the bones, teeth, skin, hair, and nails. Sphagnum can leach calcium from bones, making them soft and supple. The sinuous qualities of some of the preserved bodies are because of the bones' bending to pressure in the bog. The aquatic environment also preserves clothing made of wool or animal skin. Plant-based textiles like linen do not fare as well over time. The 2023 study was the first large-scale overview of well-dated human remains from these bogs and included analysis of more than 250 sites and 1,000 sets of remains. Burials were practiced as far back as 5200 BCE, but they flourished between 1000 BCE and 1500 CE, from the Iron Age through the Roman era to medieval times. Assessing all these remains, the study's authors categorized them into three groups: bog mummies with preserved skin, soft tissue, and hair, like the famous Toland man of Denmark; bog skeletons, whose bones are all that survived, like many of the oldest bog body finds dating back to the 9th millennium BCE; and a third mixed group, composed of partially mummified and skeletal remains. Varying conditions from bog to bog across the continent created different levels of preservation. Each factor, the bog's acidity, when a body was submerged after death, the time of year, the presence of insects, and the level of exposure over the years, contributed to a body's condition upon its discovery and determined which parts would be preserved. Visions and revisions. Scholars had little to go on in the 19th century when they began exploring in earnest how these bodies ended up in the bogs. There are no written records documenting the rituals and beliefs of pre-literate societies in the region, and early scholars pulled information wherever they could find it. Many relied heavily on the writings of Tacitus, a 1st century CE Roman historian, to inform their interpretations of the Iron Age bog sites. Despite never having been to the northern regions himself, Tacitus wrote Germania around 98 CE. Relying on second-hand and third-hand sources, he described the northern peoples and their cultures. The work extols the virtues of the Germanic tribes in order to shame Romans for what Tacitus considered their extravagant behavior at home. In the section where he describes crime and punishment among the Germanic peoples, Tacitus includes approving descriptions of hanging certain criminals while drowning others in the bogs. This reliance on Tacitus led to colorful and somewhat imaginative explanations for the conditions of each body. Their grotesque limbs, often twisted, and grinning skulls, often fractured, supported the interpretation of bog bodies as disgraced people, adulterers, thieves, and outcasts, supposedly punished with first torture, then execution, and lastly submersion in the bog. Many of these explanations lasted for decades, inspiring poems, stories, and novels about the sad fates of Europe's bog people. Not surprisingly, bog body research has taken many different turns as technology has developed over the decades. New methods, CT scans, 3D imaging, DNA analysis, and radiocarbon dating, to name a few, are creating a larger and more complex rendering of the lives and deaths of these people. Rather than romantic stories about their deaths, scholars are finding more details, more nuance, and even more mystery. The 2023 study is reshaping the conversation around the ritual importance of bog bodies. Perhaps the biggest reassessment in this role of violence is each person's death. So many of the bodies were believed to have died violently because of the state of their corpses, but the antiquity study could only conclusively identify the cause of death for 57 individuals. 45 died violently, 6 died by suicide, and 4 were accidental drownings. New research has confirmed violent causes of death for some individuals, like Denmark's Toland man, who was hanged. Injuries on other bodies are being revealed as post-mortem damage caused by pressures from the bog itself, or even by accidental damage during excavation. These broken bones and fractured skulls had been seen as evidence of torture or assault. The correct identification of the cause of these injuries could feel satisfying, but it also invites more questions about the deaths. As technology advances, scientists will be able to collect more data from these bog bodies, teasing out their centuries-old secrets. But as answers emerge, new questions are sure to follow. So here's another shot of Toland man. And we're going to read this little thing about him. It's fortunate that crease is right there by his mouth. There we go. You can see the rope right there where he was hanged. Perhaps the most famous bog body, Toland man, was discovered in 1950 by peat diggers in north-central Denmark. His peaceful expression belies the presence of a leather cord around his neck that was used to strangle him around 350 BCE. Shortly after his discovery, researchers examined his digestive tract and determined that he ate a meal around 12 to 24 hours before his death. More than 70 years later, Denmark's Silkeborg Museum revisited the last meal in search of clues about his violent demise. Perhaps the contents of his gut would reveal new details about why he was killed. Archaeologists generally agreed that Toland man was a human sacrifice, but they were curious to see if any medicinal plants were consumed to ease his transition. The comprehensive gut analysis revealed no such substances, just plant macrofossils, pollen, and microscopic evidence of food and drink. Before he died, Toland man ate slightly burned porridge with barley, flax, wild weed seeds, and some fish, indicating that he met his grim fate in full command of his senses. My goodness. And there's his foot. Poor guy. See, like you can even see his hair, his eyebrows are perfect. It's incredible, his pores. It's so fascinating to me. There's some bones. We're actually going to skip the rest, I think, in case of mistaken identity. Oh, this one is so interesting, actually. We're going to read this one. This is such an interesting story about this one. Workers suddenly halted harvesting peat in Windby, a small town in northern Germany, when a human body emerged in 1952. They alerted local archaeologists, who identified the body as a young girl because of its slight stature and delicate features. The head appeared to be shorn, a woven band covered the eyes, and a fur cloak lay around the shoulders. You can see the band there and the cloak here. To help explain the body's presence in the bog, scholars looked to the writings of 1st century CE Roman historian Tacitus and his descriptions of how Germanic peoples executed transgressors and disposed of them in bogs. A theory formed that the Windeby girl, as she came to be called, was an adulteress. To punish her, her people shaved her head, blindfolded her, and drowned her. A male body was later discovered nearby and then interpreted as her illicit lover. This explanation held until the mid-2000s, when Heather Gill Robinson of North Dakota State University tested the Windeby girl's DNA and found that she was, in fact, a he. Analysis of the remains revealed that the boy, now known as Windeby 1, had been malnourished and most likely died of natural causes. The body showed no signs of trauma, as might be expected with an execution. The blindfold could be a hairband that slipped down over the face as the head shrunk in the bog. Rather than shaving, the hairless portion of the head might be from damage during excavation or exposure prior to the discovery. The narrative fell apart further when radiocarbon dating by other scientists revealed that the supposed lover lived 3 centuries before Windeby 1. So fascinating. Another ancient story of, like murder and intrigue, completely debunked by DNA. And this is just a reconstruction of Boxton Man, using computer graphics to figure out what he would have looked like. Because here's his body, which, look at all of that hair. Isn't that incredible? That all of this crazy blonde matted hair survived. So they think this is how he actually looked. Let me get that a little better. Fascinating, I think. How incredible that it's just bones and then a whole head of perfectly just normal hair. Looks like a wig on a skeleton. But we're going to end it there. So yeah, very, very different stories of murder. And if you're wondering why I skipped over this story of the princes in the tower, well, you're just going to have to wait a couple of weeks until I read their story. Probably one of the most famous murder cases in England's history. But this article has some incredible revelations. My jaw was on the floor. I could not believe the research that's come out about that case. I suppose you could say a cold case. So we're going to stop there. Let's bring Rasputin back. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this style of content, please consider subscribing. Like I said, we're going to do another series next week all about Rome. So you're going to want to subscribe so you won't miss out. And like I said, if you want to pick future magazine articles, you can click the join button or the first link in the description box to become a channel member and pick some new articles very soon once I get my new issue in my new address in Washington. So excited. So I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a good